In Las Vegas's MGM Grand Garden Arena, a cocky Navy SEAL named Dane Viper Cross was about to add insult to injury after flattening a Marine in front of thousands. A charity exhibition turned volatile when Cross, high on bravado, publicly challenged Chuck Norris live on mic. Chuck Norris wasn't your typical guest of honor. For decades, he was the face of martial arts cinema and an elite Tang Soo Do master, an Air Force veteran who trained with Bruce Lee and held black belts across multiple disciplines. His reputation wasn't built on noise but on necessity. When Cross mocked the legend and dared him into the octagon, he had no idea he was walking into a masterclass in humility. Chuck responded not with trash talk, but with calm, surgical movement that dismantled every ounce of Cross's ego strike by precise strike. The arena held its breath as every deflected punch became a lesson in respect. What began as showboating from a rising warrior became the quiet undoing of pride. The MGM Grandstand, millions watching, would never be the same after Chuck Norris showed the world that real strength never needs to raise its voice. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. A brutal punch echoed across the arena, sending the Marine instructor crashing to the mat. The crowd gasped as the referee dove in, checking if the man could even move. But the winner was already parading. Around, arms raised high, grin stretched wide. He strutted past the cameras, leaned over his opponent, and shouted insults. Loud, cocky, unapologetic. The MGM Grand Garden Arena in Las Vegas pulsed with raw energy on this Saturday night. Every seat filled for the Warriors United charity combat event, a high-profile showcase where elite military operators competed to raise funds for veterans' families. Floodlights beamed down onto the octagonal cage at center stage while cameras flashed like lightning. Banners representing each military branch hung from the rafters, swaying gently in the air-conditioned breeze. In the commentary booth above the floor, Major Samira Blake adjusted her headset. The former Green Beret's sharp eyes tracked every movement in the cage below. "And there you have it, folks," she said, her voice carrying through the arena speakers. "Dane Viper Cross remains undefeated in these exhibition matches. That's his 5th straight victory, and perhaps his most dominant performance yet." Her co-commentator nodded. "Sergeant Reyes is no pushover either." The Marine Corps' top hand-to-hand combat instructor completely overwhelmed. Down in the cage, Dane Cross circled the perimeter, playing to the crowd. His 6'2" frame rippled with defined muscle beneath the tight rash guard bearing his Navy SEAL trident. At 32, he was in his physical prime and he knew it. The sweat on his shaved head glistened under the spotlights as he flexed for the cameras. Medics attended to Mike Boulder Reyes, who was finally sitting up, eyes still unfocused from the knockout blow. The Marine's usually stoic face betrayed nothing, but the defeat hung heavy in the air around him. "What strikes me," Major Blake continued, "is the contrast in demeanor. Reyes entered with respect, fought with honor, and even in defeat, maintains his dignity. Cross, on the other hand." She let the thought trail off as Dane grabbed the microphone from the ring announcer. The arena's buzz quieted slightly in anticipation. "That's how it's done, ladies and gentlemen." Cross's voice boomed through the speakers. "Navy over Marines. Sorry, Boulder. Maybe stick to teaching instead of fighting." Some fans roared with excitement. Others exchanged uneasy glances. The VIP section, filled with decorated veterans, celebrities, and high-ranking officers, remained notably reserved. Not far from the cage, front row center, sat Chuck Norris. At 85, the martial arts legend still carried himself with the same quiet strength that had defined his career. Dressed in a simple black button-down and jeans, he sat beside Colonel Adrian Hawk Roth, the event's organizer. Chuck's face remained expressionless, eyes steady beneath the iconic brow. No clapping, No reaction. Just sharp, watchful eyes taking in every detail. I see. We've got some legends in the house, Cross continued, his breath still heavy from exertion. Hollywood tough guys, retired champions all past their prime. He chuckled into the mic. This is what real combat looks like now, folks. Evolution at its finest. Colonel Roth leaned toward Chuck. Sorry about this, he muttered. Cross has been getting worse with each win. Great fighter, but the ego's out of control. Chuck offered a subtle nod but said nothing. His expression hadn't changed, not even a flicker. Back in the cage, Cross was still basking in his moment. Any other branch want to step up? Air Force? Army? I've got plenty left in the tank. He laughed, bouncing on his heels. Then it happened. The arrogant fighter's eyes casually swept across the front row and locked onto Chuck Norris. The arena seemed to hold its breath as recognition dawned on Cross's face. His grin widened, a predator spotting fresh prey. Well, well, he said into the mic, voice dropping to a theatrical hush. Look who we have here. The myth himself. In the commentary booth, Major Blake tensed. Oh, he wouldn't. Cross pointed directly at Chuck, still breathing heavily from his fight. Chuck Norris! The legend! The man whose roundhouse kick supposedly turned off the sun. He laughed at his own joke. Tell me, sir, you think all those movie fights prepared you for something real? Something like this? He gestured around the cage. A hush rippled through the crowd. In the press section, cameras swiveled toward Chuck. The tension in the air thickened as everyone waited for his response. Chuck remained seated for a long second. Calm. Still. His weathered face betrayed nothing, not anger, not amusement, not even mild interest. Colonel Roth shifted uncomfortably beside him. This is disrespectful. Someone muttered loudly enough to be heard. Cross wasn't finished. He leaned against the fence of the cage, pointing the microphone directly at Chuck. Hey, I grew up watching Walker, Texas Ranger. Great show, really. But this? He tapped the mat with his foot. This is real. No stunt doubles, no second takes, no Hollywood magic. The first chant started somewhere in the back of the arena. Soft at first, then growing. Chuck, Chuck, Chuck. Cross heard it too and played to it. What do you say, Norris? For old time's sake. Show these young folks what you've got left in the tank? His tone was somewhere between mocking and challenging, the perfect blend to provoke a response. Chuck, Chuck, Chuck. The chant grew louder, rippling through the crowd like a wave. Some fans were standing now, phones raised to capture whatever might happen next. In the commentary booth, Major Blake had gone silent, watching the scene unfold with professional concern. Her producer spoke in her earpiece. Stay with this whatever happens. Chuck still hadn't moved, hadn't spoken. His eyes, those same eyes that had stared down countless opponents on screen and in real competition, remained fixed on Cross. The SEAL's cocky grin faltered slightly under that unwavering gaze. Then, with deliberate calm, Chuck Norris stood. The simple act sent electricity through the arena. The chanting stopped abruptly, replaced by a heavy anticipation. Chuck adjusted the cuffs of his shirt with unhurried precision, his movements measured and economical. Not a wasted gesture. Oh my, whispered Major Blake into her microphone. Ladies and gentlemen, I think we're about to witness something truly extraordinary. Chuck took one step toward the cage, then another. His walk was smooth, balanced the stride of a man who, even in his 80s, remained in complete control of his body. He didn't rush, didn't play to the crowd, didn't need to. The arena went dead silent. Colonel Roth stood too, concern etched on his face. But he made no move to stop what was happening. He knew better than most what Chuck Norris was capable of, not just physically, but in terms of presence. The lesson that was about to be taught went far beyond fighting. Cross's smirk widened as Chuck approached, but those watching closely might have noticed a flicker of uncertainty in his eyes. The young SEAL straightened, puffing his chest slightly unconsciously preparing. "Well, I'll be damned," he said, though his voice had lost some of its edge. "The legend accepts the challenge." Chuck hadn't accepted anything. He hadn't said a word. But as he reached the steps to the cage, everyone in the arena knew everything was about to change. Chuck Norris stood at the foot of the steps leading to the cage, the arena's silence, a physical weight pressing down on every spectator. His posture remained relaxed, but poised a coiled spring at perfect equilibrium. The path between him and Dane Cross suddenly seemed charged with invisible current. In the commentary booth, Major Samira Blake's voice was hushed, almost reverent. "For those just joining our broadcast, we're witnessing an unscheduled moment that defies description. Chuck Norris's. That Chuck Norris appears to be answering an impromptu challenge from Navy SEAL Dane Cross." Her co-commentator cleared his throat nervously. Should someone stop this? Mr. Norris is in his 80s. Major Blake's smile was audible in her response. "With all due respect to Mr. Cross's considerable abilities, I'm not sure age is the determining factor here." Down on the floor, Colonel Roth had made his way to the cage officials. After a brief, intense conversation, he gave a curt nod and stepped back. The veteran ranger knew Chuck well enough to understand this wasn't about ego or proving anything. This was about something deeper. Inside the cage, Dane Cross bounced lightly on the balls of his feet, feeding off the electric atmosphere. His initial bravado had given way to a more complex emotion, still confident, but now tinged with the first hints of doubt. The silence of the crowd unsettled him. He was used to noise, to reaction positive or negative. This hushed anticipation was something new. "Well?" he called out, voice echoing in the quiet. "Are we doing this, old-timer? Or just standing there looking tough?" Chuck's expression remained unchanged as he began ascending the steps. The security personnel stepped aside without question, parting like water. A production assistant rushed forward with a clipboard liability waivers, release forms, but Colonel Roth waved her away with a sharp gesture. "He knows what he's doing," Roth muttered. At cage side, an official held the door open. Chuck paused, removed his watch, a simple black timepiece, and handed it to Colonel Roth. Then, with fluid grace that belied his years, he stepped through the door and into the octagon. The crowd erupted a volcano of sound after the tense silence. Phones lifted higher, camera flashes intensified, and the chant resumed with renewed fervor. "Chuck! Chuck! Chuck!" Cross's grin returned, wider than ever, but a keen observer might have noticed it didn't quite reach his eyes anymore. He spread his arms wide, playing to the crowd. "Ladies and gentlemen," he shouted, though without the microphone now, his voice barely carried over the noise. "Hollywood meets reality." Chuck stood just inside the cage door, taking a moment to remove his shoes. His movements were methodical, unhurried, a man following rituals established decades ago. He placed them neatly against the fence, then turned to face Cross, directly. Still, he hadn't spoken a single word. Major Blake's commentary continued, her voice cutting through the arena's din. "What we're seeing is extraordinary. Two different generations, two different philosophies about what combat means, what strength means, about to collide in this cage." Cross circled slowly, sizing up his opponent. "No referee, no rules," he called out. "Just man to man. That work for you, legend?" Chuck's silence was his answer. He simply moved to the center of the mat and settled into a relaxed stanzano, quite fighting position, but ready. His eyes never left Cross's face. The SEAL laughed, though it sounded slightly forced now. "Silent treatment, huh? Saving your breath?" Smart move at your age. The jab fell flat in the electrified air. Cross sensed it too and switched tactics, addressing the crowd instead. Don't worry, folks. I'll go easy on the senior citizen. He turned back to Chuck. No permanent damage, right? Just enough to show these people what's real and what's Hollywood. In the front row, Colonel Roth stood with arms crossed, his weathered face tense but resigned. Beside him, Mike Boulder Reyes had returned from medical, a butterfly bandage across his eyebrow, but otherwise recovered. The Marine watched with fierce intensity, still in his fight shorts. Should have been me, Reyes muttered. Roth shook his head slightly. No. This was always going to happen. Some lessons can only be taught by the right teacher. Inside the cage, Cross had finished his theatrics and was settling into a fighting stance, his previous mirth giving way to focus. Whatever his faults, he was a professional decorated special operator with real combat experience. He knew when to flip the switch. Last chance to back out, old man, he said. Voice lower now, meant only for Chuck's ears. Chuck's response was to slightly adjust his stance, a subtle shift of weight, a minute change in hand position. To the untrained eye, it was barely perceptible. To fighters watching, it spoke volumes. Major Blake caught it immediately. Ladies and gentlemen, Chuck Norris just transitioned into what appears to be a modified Tang Soo Do stance. For those unfamiliar, that's the Korean martial art where he holds an 8th degree black belt. Cross noticed too. His eyes narrowed slightly, professional assessment overtaking showmanship. He began circling, cutting angles, looking for openings. Chuck pivoted smoothly to maintain position. His movements economical, precise. For several long seconds, they circled each other in the cage's center, predator and predator, neither willing to concede the role of prey. The crowd's noise receded to a low hum as tension built. Then Cross exploded forward. The SEAL launched a lightning-fast jab-cross combination, his fists blurring with speed and precision. For a man his size, his quickness was remarkable. Testament to thousands of hours of training. Chuck didn't retreat. With subtle shifts of his head and torso, he allowed the punches to slip past close enough that Cross could feel the displacement of air, but connecting with nothing substantial. The defensive movement was so economical, so precise, that many in the crowd missed it entirely. One moment, Cross was surely about to land clean shots. The next, his fists found only empty space. Cross reset, momentarily surprised, then pressed forward again with a more complex combination jab. Cross, hook, uppercut, the strikes coming in rapid succession, each designed to set up the next, to force a reaction he could exploit. Again, Chuck's defense was masterful. Small movements, minimal energy expenditure, and the physical embodiment of the martial principle of economy of motion. Where Cross attacked with explosive power, Chuck responded with efficient precision. The young fighter backed off slightly, reassessing. His expression had changed now, the cocky grin replaced by focused concentration. This wasn't going according to plan. In the commentary booth, Major Blake leaned forward. What we're witnessing is the difference between fighting at someone and fighting with them. Cross is throwing textbook combinations with tremendous skill. But Chuck is. Well, he's not even fighting yet. He's reading, feeling the rhythm, allowing Cross to reveal his patterns. Down at Cage's side, Boulder Reyes nodded slowly in recognition. He's doing to Cross what Cross did to me, but without throwing a single strike. Colonel Roth's lips twitched in the ghost of a smile. Just wait. Inside the cage, Cross reset again, frustration beginning to show in his movements. He was unaccustomed to missing so consistently. Each failed connection was a small wound to his confidence. Come on, he growled, more to himself than to Chuck. Fight back. Chuck remained silent, his breathing controlled, his eyes never leaving Cross's face. not studying his hands, or his feet, or his shoulders but his eyes. Reading intention before it manifested as movement. Cross exploded again, this time with a different approach, a feinted jab, followed by a lightning-fast leg kick aimed at Chuck's lead leg. A tactical choice, targeting mobility, especially against an older opponent. The kick never landed. With timing that bordered on precognition, Chuck shifted his weight, allowing the kick to brush harmlessly past his leg. The movement was so subtle that Cross was momentarily thrown off balance by the lack of expected impact. Telling and preparing this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. In that microsecond of imbalance, Chuck moved. His counter was not spectacular or flashy. No spinning kicks or acrobatics. Just a perfectly timed straight right hand that connected solidly with Cross's chest as the younger fighter was resetting. The impact was enough to stop Cross's momentum and force him back a step, not devastating, but controlling. The message was clear. I could have aimed that at your face. The crowd erupted at the first offensive move from the legend. The chant resumed with renewed vigor. Chuck! 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 Cross's eyes widened, slight surprise, then renewed focus. The game had changed. This wasn't an exhibition anymore. This was a fight. He reset, more cautious now. Respect, beginning to temper his approach. His next combination was more measured jab, Cross textbook and tight. Chuck slipped the first two and parried the third, using Cross's extended arm to momentarily control distance. Again, not hurting the younger fighter, but dictating terms. Cross disengaged, circling again, reassessing. The cockiness had vanished from his expression, replaced by something approaching genuine concentration. For perhaps the first time in years, he was being forced to fight at the edge of his abilities. That's the thing about legends, Major Blake commented from the booth. They don't become legends by accident. The dynamic in the arena had shifted completely. The spectacle of an aging icon accepting a challenge had transformed into a master class in fighting fundamentals. Phones remained raised, but the mood had changed from anticipation of a train wreck to witnessing something profound. Cross launched another attack. This time, a complex sequence ending with a powerful roundhouse kick. Chuck blocked the initial punches and, in a move that defied his age, caught the kick cleanly. For a heartbeat, he held Cross's leg trapped against his side. Their eyes met at close range. Chuck's face remained calm, almost serene. Cross's showed the first flickers of genuine concern. Then, Chuck released the leg, allowing Cross to reset once more. Not exploiting the capture, not taking the younger man down, just demonstrating that he could have. Colonel Roth nodded approvingly. He's not here to hurt the kid. He's here to teach him. Boulder Reyes squinted at the action. Teaching him what, exactly? Roth's response was simple. Respect. Inside the cage, Cross was growing visibly frustrated. His attacks were being neutralized with seemingly minimal effort. Yet Chuck wasn't pressing his own offense. It was like fighting a ghost substantial enough to block and parry, but refusing to engage on expected terms. Fight me! Cross finally burst out, loud enough for the front rows to hear. Actually fight me! Chuck's expression didn't change, but something shifted in his stance, a subtle realignment that only the most experienced fighters would recognize. His response was coming, but not in words. The arena held its breath, sensing the pivot point of this unexpected confrontation. The lesson was about to escalate. Cross, determined to force the action, launched his most committed attack yet, a blitzing combination of strikes designed to overwhelm through sheer volume and intensity. For a moment, it seemed to work. Chuck gave ground, backing toward the cage wall as the flurry of punches and kicks filled the space between them. But those who had studied Chuck Norris, truly studied his fighting philosophy, recognized what was happening. He wasn't retreating. He was leading. When his back neared the fence, Chuck planted his feet. As Cross launched what he thought would be a finishing sequence, the legend moved. Not with the explosive speed of youth, but with the perfect timing of experience. As Cross overextended on a right hook, Chuck pivoted, using the younger fighter's momentum against him. In one fluid motion, he slipped the punch and delivered a counter-strike of his own. Not to the head, but to the body. Clean. Precise. Enough to drive the air from Cross's lungs, but not enough to cause lasting damage. Cross gasped, momentarily stunned by the perfectly placed shot. He backed away, eyes wide with newfound respect and perhaps a touch of fear. The crowd roared its approval, but Chuck's expression never changed. This wasn't about them. This wasn't even about winning. This was about something far more fundamental. As Cross recovered and reset, the dynamic had irrevocably shifted. The brash young fighter now faced the legend with genuine wariness. Whatever happened next, the lesson had begun to take hold. Chuck stood in the center of the cage, calm and ready, waiting for Cross's next move. The silence between them spoke volumes that no trash talk ever could. The atmosphere in the MGM Grand Garden Arena had transformed completely. What had begun as a spectacly cocky young fighter challenging an aging legend had evolved into something approaching reverence. The crowd noise had changed from raucous cheers to a more focused intensity, punctuated by gasps and murmurs as the confrontation unfolded. Inside the cage, Dane Viper Cross circled Chuck Norris with newfound caution. Gone was the theatrical bouncing, the played-up swagger. His movements now were tight, professional, the true fighter, emerging from beneath the showman's veneer. Sweat glistened on his forehead, as much from tension as exertion. Chuck remained centered, his breathing measured and controlled. Despite being in his 80s, his posture showed no fatigue. His eyes tracked Cross with laser focus, seeing not just the man's physical movements but the intention forming behind them. What we're witnessing, Major Samira Blake observed from the commentary booth, is the difference between fighting to prove something and fighting because you have nothing to prove. Cross entered this confrontation seeking validation. Chuck stepped in seeking something else entirely. Cross feinted left, then drove forward with a sharp right jab followed by a powerful cross. Chuck parried the first strike and slipped the second, countering with a short, precise shot to Cross's ribs that landed with audible impact. The Seal grimaced but pressed on, launching a quick combination ending with a roundhouse kick. Chuck blocked the punches and stepped inside the kick's arc, disrupting Cross's balance and forcing him to reset once more. "Stop dancing and fight," Cross hissed through clenched teeth, frustration evident in his voice. Chuck's response was silence and continued tactical precision. Another exchange, another series of masterfully deflected attacks, another carefully measured counter that landed just hard enough to make a point without causing serious harm. In the front row, Colonel Roth leaned toward Boulder Reyes. "Watch his eyes," the colonel murmured. "Chuck's not looking at Cross's hands or feet. He's reading his center line, his weight distribution, his intentions before they manifest." Reyes nodded slowly. "He's fighting the man, not the technique." The confrontation continued, with Cross growing increasingly frustrated. Each exchange followed a similar pattern. Cross would attack with technical precision and considerable power. Chuck would neutralize the offense with minimal movement, then counter just enough to demonstrate control without pressing for a finish. After several minutes of this, Cross backed away, breathing heavily. His earlier bravado had been replaced by something approaching desperation. This wasn't how the story was supposed to unfold. He was the rising star, the new generation. How was he being so thoroughly controlled by a man old enough to be his grandfather? "You can't win just by defending," Cross called out, trying to goad Chuck into a more aggressive approach. "That's not how fights work." Chuck remained silent, but his eyes spoke volumes. Patient, waiting, teaching without words. Cross reset and charged again, this time with a blitzing combination designed to overwhelm through sheer volume. For several seconds, the cage was a blur of movement as Cross threw everything in his arsenal: jabs, crosses, hooks, uppercuts, leg kicks, a storm of offensive techniques. Chuck weathered it all, his defensive movements so efficient they appeared almost casual. Not flashy evasions or dramatic blocks, but the subtle shifts of weight and position that made attacks miss by millimeters rather than inches. When Cross finally exhausted his combination, chest heaving with exertion, Chuck countered. A short, compact right hand slipped past Cross's guard and connected solidly with his solar plexus. Not a knockout blow, but a demonstration I could end this if I chose to. Cross stumbled back, gasping. The crowd held its collective breath. "Ladies and gentlemen," Major Blake said quietly into her microphone, "what we're seeing isn't just a physical confrontation, it's a philosophical one. Cross represents the modern approach to combat, aggressive, spectacular, designed as much for audience as effectiveness. Chuck embodies the traditional martial path: efficient, purposeful, concerned only with what works." Inside the cage, Cross had recovered enough to reset once more. His expression had changed again, the frustration giving way to something deeper, more primal. The confrontation had stripped away the performer, leaving only the fighter. And that fighter was beginning to understand he was outmatched, not by strength or speed, but by something far more fundamental. "I get it," he said, voice low enough that only Chuck could hear. "You're making a point. But I'm not going to just give up." Chuck's eyes acknowledged the statement with the barest hint of approval, the first emotional reaction he'd shown since entering the cage. Cross attacked again, but differently now. His movements were more measured, less theatrical. No wasted motion, no played-up wind-up. Just clean, technical striking. For the first time in the confrontation, he was fighting like the elite operator his background suggested, not for show, but for effectiveness. Chuck met the renewed assault with the same controlled defense, but there was a subtle shift in his demeanor, a recognition of the change in his opponent's approach. The exchange continued for several more moments, neither man giving ground. Cross had found a new rhythm, more disciplined and focused. Chuck continued his masterclass in defensive fighting, but with slightly more engagement, now meeting skill with skill rather than simply neutralizing. In the commentary booth, Major Blake leaned forward. "There's the adjustment. Cross has finally abandoned the showmanship and is fighting clean. And look at the response. Chuck is meeting him at that level. The lesson is being received." The crowd sensed the shift too. The atmosphere changed from spectacle to appreciation, martial artists in the audience, recognizing the technical display unfolding before them. As the exchange concluded, Cross backed away once more. His breathing was heavy but controlled now, his eyes clear and focused. The transformation was striking from cocky showman to respectful combatant in the span of a few minutes. "I still don't understand," he said quietly. "You could have ended this already. Why haven't you?" Chuck's silence remained unbroken, but his eyes conveyed what words could not. "That's not why I'm here." Cross nodded slowly, understanding beginning to dawn. "One more round," he said. "Your terms." Chuck shifted his stance slightly in acceptance of the proposition. The crowd sensed the movement toward conclusion and leaned forward collectively, phones raised higher to capture what came next. Cross centered himself, took a deep breath, and launched one final attack. Not wild or desperate now, but measured and technical. His combinations flowed with genuine skill, the product of thousands of hours of training and real-world application. Chuck met the assault with his characteristic efficiency, but with a new element added: As Cross committed to a powerful right cross, Chuck moved. Not just defensively, but with offensive purpose. The counter came with such perfect timing that many in the crowd missed it entirely. As Cross's punch slipped past Chuck's head, the legend delivered a straight right hand that connected cleanly with Cross's jaw. Not thrown with destructive power, but with pinpoint accuracy and just enough force to make the point unmistakable. Cross's head snapped back, his eyes momentarily unfocused. He stumbled, regained his balance, then steadied himself. The message had been delivered. In that single exchange, Chuck had demonstrated the gulf between them, not just in technique, but in understanding. The arena fell silent as Cross stood there, blinking, processing what had just happened. Then, slowly, deliberately, he lowered his hands. Not in surrender, but in acknowledgement. Chuck lowered his hands as well, his posture relaxing from fighting stance to simply standing. Still, he hadn't spoken a single word since entering the cage. The two fighters stood facing each other in the center of the octagon, separated by arm's length but by decades of experience. The contrast was stark. Cross breathing heavily, a trickle of blood at the corner of his mouth. Chuck calm and composed, not even slightly winded. Then Cross did something that shocked the arena into complete silence. He bowed a formal, traditional martial arts bow. Not theatrical or mocking, but genuine. The gesture of a student acknowledging a master. Chuck returned the bow with equal formality, the movement fluid and natural. When they straightened, Cross extended his hand. Chuck took it without hesitation, the handshake firm but not challenging. "I misjudged," Cross said quietly. "Thank you for the lesson." Chuck nodded once, the barest hint of a smile touching his eyes, though not quite reaching his lips. Then he released Cross's hand and turned toward the cage door. The arena erupted in thunderous applause as Chuck made his way out of the octagon. His exit as understated as his entrance had been. No victory celebration, no played-up moment for the cameras. Just quiet dignity and the unmistakable aura of a mission accomplished. As Chuck descended the steps, Colonel Roth waited with his watch. The old ranger's eyes were bright with something approaching pride. "Still got it," Roth said simply, handing over the timepiece. Chuck accepted the watch with a nod of thanks, slipping it back onto his wrist with practiced ease. Then, together, they began walking toward the exit tunnel, leaving behind a transformed arena and a humbled fighter. In the cage, Dane Cross stood alone, watching Chuck's departure with newfound understanding. The lesson had been delivered not with words or excessive force, but with something far more powerful: example. Major Blake's voice cut through the continuing applause. "Ladies and gentlemen, what we just witnessed wasn't just a physical confrontation. It was the passing of wisdom from one generation to another. A reminder that true mastery isn't about who can shout the loudest or hit the hardest. It's about control, efficiency, and purpose." As Chuck disappeared into the tunnel, the arena continued its ovation. Not for a knockout or a spectacular finish, but for something far rarer: a perfect demonstration of what martial arts, at its core, was always meant to be. The thunderous applause was still echoing through the MGM Grand Garden Arena as Chuck Norris disappeared down the exit tunnel. The crowd remained on its feet, phones raised high, capturing the moment when legend became reality. In the aftermath of what had just transpired, the atmosphere had transformed from raucous entertainment to something approaching reverence. Inside the cage, Dane Viper Cross stood alone, the reality of what had just happened slowly sinking in. The trickle of blood at the corner of his mouth was a physical reminder, but the true impact went much deeper. For perhaps the first time in his professional life, the Navy SEAL had been completely outclassed, not by superior strength or speed, but by something far more fundamental: Major Samira Blake's voice carried through the arena speakers. For those just joining our broadcast, you've missed something truly extraordinary. Chuck Norris. The Chuck Norris just stepped into this cage following an impromptu challenge from Navy SEAL Dane Cross. What followed wasn't so much a fight as a masterclass. Down in the front row, Boulder Reyes watched with newfound perspective. His own defeat at Cross's hands earlier now seemed part of a larger story, a necessary chapter leading to this unexpected climax. Did you know? Reyes asked Colonel Roth, who had returned to his seat after escorting Chuck to the exit. The colonel shook his head slightly. That this would happen tonight? No. That it would happen eventually? Absolutely. He gestured toward the cage. Some lessons can only be learned the hard way. Inside the octagon, Cross had moved to the fence, leaning against it as he collected himself. The medical team approached, but he waved them off with a gesture. This wasn't about physical injury. It was about something deeper. An official entered the cage with a microphone. Unsure how to proceed, given the unscheduled nature of what had just occurred. The event needed to continue. There were still 2 more scheduled bouts, but the energy in the building had shifted so dramatically that a reset seemed necessary. Cross saw the official's uncertainty and straightened from the fence. He beckoned for the microphone, and after a moment's hesitation, the official handed it over. The arena quieted slightly, curious what the humbled fighter might say. The cameras focused tight on his face, still confident, but transformed. The cockiness had been replaced by something approaching clarity. Well, Cross began, his voice rougher than before. That didn't go quite how I planned. A ripple of laughter moved through the crowd, not mocking, but appreciative of the self-awareness. I want to thank Chuck Norris for accepting my challenge. Cross paused, searching for the right words. Though I'm not sure accepting is the right term. He didn't need to prove anything to me or anyone else in this arena. I was the one with something to prove. He touched the corner of his mouth, checking the blood, then continued. I've been fighting my whole adult life in war zones, in training, in competitions like this. Somewhere along the way, I started to believe my own hype. Started thinking that being loud about your skills meant something. Cross looked toward the tunnel where Chuck had exited. What? Mr. Crosslet of Laundra. Norris just showed all of uses that real mastery doesn't need to announce itself. It doesn't need trash talk or showboating. It just is. The crowd absorbed his words in respectful silence. In the commentary booth, Major Blake nodded approvingly. That, she said quietly into her microphone, might be the most important victory of the night. Cross handed the microphone back to the official and made his way toward the cage door. As he neared it, he paused, looking back at the center of the octagon where the confrontation had played out. Something compelled him to return to that spotto stand where he had been so thoroughly outclassed. The crowd watched in curious silence as Cross walked to the center of the mat and stood there, eyes closed, replaying what had just happened. Not the physical exchange, but the deeper lesson beneath it. When he opened his eyes again, his expression had changed, less the cocky showman, more the disciplined warrior his training had always intended him to be. With quiet dignity, he walked to the cage door and exited. No raised arms, no playing to the cameras. Just a man who had entered one way and left another. In the tunnel leading back to the locker rooms, Cross found himself walking alone. The production assistants and handlers who normally surrounded fighters after bouts kept a respectful distance, sensing the internal process unfolding. He could hear the announcer's voice echoing behind him, introducing the next scheduled fight, but it seemed distant, almost irrelevant. As he rounded a corner, Cross stopped short. Standing in the middle of the corridor, calm and unhurried, was Chuck Norris. The legend hadn't left the building after all. He stood with hands loosely at his sides, his expression as unreadable as it had been in the cage. Behind him, Colonel Roth leaned against the wall, arms crossed, watching the encounter unfold. For a long moment, neither Chuck nor Cross spoke. The younger fighter felt the weight of the silence, understanding now that this too was part of the lesson. Finally, he found his voice. "I owe you an apology," Cross said simply. Chuck studied him for a moment, then gave a slight nod of acknowledgement. "I've spent my career in places where being the loudest, the most aggressive, meant survival," Cross continued. "Somewhere along the way, I confused that with being the best." Chuck's expression softened almost imperceptibly. For the first time since the confrontation began, he spoke his voice low and measured, carrying the weight of decades of experience. "The loudest person in the room," he said, "is rarely the strongest." The words hung in the air between them, simple but profound. Cross absorbed them, nodding slowly in understanding. "I'd like to learn more," he said finally. "Not just techniques, but whatever that was you just demonstrated in there." Chuck considered this for a moment, then reached into his pocket and withdrew a simple business card. He handed it to Cross without explanation. "When you're ready," he said simply. Cross looked down at the card, plain white with just a name and phone number, then back up at Chuck. But the legend had already moved past him, walking back toward the arena with Colonel Roth falling into step beside him. Left alone in the corridor, Cross turned the card over in his fingers, the weight of it somehow greater than its physical presence would suggest. Not just contact information, but an invitation, a door to a different path than the one he'd been walking. He tucked the card carefully into his hand, wrapping, and continued toward the locker room, his steps lighter than they had been in years. The MGM Grand Garden Arena had returned to its regular programming. The next scheduled bout was underway, two Army Rangers facing off in a technical grappling match, but the energy in the building remained transformed. What had happened between Chuck Norris and Dane Cross had elevated the event from entertainment to something approaching ceremony. In the commentary booth, Major Samira Blake had settled back into professional analysis, breaking down the technical aspects of the current match. But her mind kept returning to the unscheduled confrontation, the perfect demonstration of martial philosophy that had unfolded before her eyes. "Focus on the controlled grip transitions here," she said into her microphone, guiding the audience through the grappling exchange. "Notice how neither fighter is using excessive strength, it's all about leverage and timing." Her co-commentator nodded. "Reminiscent of what we saw earlier, isn't it? Economy of motion, precision over power." Major Blake smiled. "I think every fight we see tonight will be viewed through that lens now." Chuck Norris didn't just teach Dane Cross a lesson. He reminded all of us what this is supposed to be about. Down in the VIP section, Chuck had returned to his seat beside Colonel Roth. If the crowd was surprised by his reappearance, they showed it only in respectful nods and occasional thumbs-up gestures from nearby spectators. No one approached for autographs or selfies. Something about Chuck's demeanor, calm but clearly private, created an invisible boundary that even the most enthusiastic fans instinctively respected. "You plan to come back?" Roth observed quietly. Chuck's slight smile was answer enough. "The kid needed both parts of the lesson," Roth continued. "The public fall and the private hand up." Chuck nodded once, turning his attention back to the match in progress. His expression revealed nothing of his thoughts, but there was a subtle satisfaction in his posture, the look of a teacher who had successfully imparted a difficult but necessary lesson. In the locker room area, far from the roaring crowd, Dane Cross sat alone on a bench. He had declined the usual post-fight medical check, insisting he was physically fine. The team doctor had reluctantly agreed after a cursory examination showed nothing more serious than the small cut at the corner of his mouth. Cross had unwrapped his hands slowly. Methodically, a ritual he usually rushed through in his eagerness to return to the spotlight. Tonight, he found himself appreciating the deliberate process, the simple focus it required. When he reached the final layer on his right hand, Chuck's business card fell onto the bench beside him. He picked it up, studying it again. Simple white cardstock. The name, Chuck Norris, printed in black, followed by a phone number. No titles, no credentials, no flourishes. It didn't need any. Quite a night. Cross looked up to find Mike Boulder Reyes standing in the doorway, still in his fight shorts, but with a warm-up jacket thrown over his shoulders. "You could say that," Cross replied, gesturing to the bench beside him. Reyes hesitated, then sat. The two fighters' opponents less than an hour ago sat in silence for a moment. "I owe you an apology too," Cross said finally. "The way I acted after our fight." Reyes waved it off. "We all have lessons to learn. Some more publicly than others," Cross said with a rueful smile, touching the cut on his lip. Reyes chuckled. "If it helps, I think half the fighters here were secretly hoping to be in your shoes. Getting embarrassed by an 80-year-old man? Learning from a legend?" Reyes corrected. "There's not a martial artist alive who wouldn't trade places with you right now." Cross considered this, turning the business card over in his fingers. "He spoke to me afterward. In the tunnel." Reyes's eyebrows rose. "What did he say?" "Not much. Just enough." Cross tucked the card carefully into his wallet. "What about you? How are you feeling after our fight? Physically?" "I've had worse." Reyes shrugged. "Ego's a bit bruised, but that'll heal." "Next time," Cross said, "I'd like us to train together first. Compare techniques, share knowledge, if you're open to it." Reyes studied him for a moment, looking for signs of the old arrogance. Finding none, he nodded. "I'd like that." The two fighters shook hands, not the theatrical post-fight handshake for cameras, but a genuine gesture between professionals. "I should get back," Reyes said, standing. "Colonel Roth wants all the participants visible for the final bout." Cross nodded. "I'll be there in a minute." After Reyes left, Cross sat for a moment longer, absorbing the quiet of the empty locker room. His mind replayed not the physical confrontation with Chuck, but the moment afterward, the silent exchange in the tunnel that had somehow meant more than all the technical mastery displayed in the cage. Finally, he stood and prepared to return to the arena. As he reached the door, he caught a glimpse of himself in a wall mirror. The reflection showed the same physical person who had entered the building hours earlier. But the eyes looking back at him belonged to someone different. Someone humbled, but somehow stronger for it. Up in the broadcast booth, Major Blake was wrapping up her commentary on the latest bout when her producer spoke in her earpiece. "We've got Chuck Norris and Colonel Roth coming up for a quick interview during the break. 3 minutes, tops." Major Blake straightened in surprise. "Chuck agreed to an interview?" "Colonel Roth arranged it. Said Chuck had something he wanted to share." Minutes later, as the fighters from the recently concluded match exited the cage, Chuck and Colonel Roth made their way up to the broadcast position. The crowd noticed the movement and a ripple of recognition spread across the arena, phones rising once more to capture the legend's appearance. Major Blake welcomed them warmly, offering Chuck the seat beside her. He took it with a polite nod of thanks. "Ladies and gentlemen, I'm honored to be joined by Chuck Norris and Colonel Adrian Hawk Roth, the organizer of tonight's Warriors United charity event." Major Blake turned to Chuck. "I have to say, Mr. Norris, none of us expected to see you in the cage tonight." Chuck's smile was slight, but genuine. "Neither did I." The simple response, delivered with perfect timing, drew appreciative laughter from the broadcast team. Major Blake continued. "What we witnessed was extraordinary, not just the physical demonstration, but the lesson behind it. Was that your intention when you accepted Cross's challenge?" Chuck considered the question carefully before answering. "When someone challenges you publicly, there are many ways to respond. You can ignore it, you can match their energy, or you can change the terms of engagement entirely. And that's what you chose to do." Major Blake nodded. "Young fighters today have tremendous technical skill, Chuck continued. What sometimes gets lost is the why behind the how. Martial arts isn't about dominating others, it's about mastering yourself. Colonel Roth leaned forward. That's what this whole event is about, when you get down to it. These men and women have all served their country in combat roles. They know about fighting for real stakes. Tonight is about channeling that experience into something positive, raising money for veterans, while demonstrating the discipline and control that makes our special operators the best in the world. And the confrontation with Cross? Major Blake asked. Chuck's expression remained measured. Dane Cross is an exceptional fighter with a distinguished service record. What happened tonight doesn't diminish that. If anything, it adds to it. How so? Major Blake pressed. The true measure of a warrior isn't how they handle victory, Chuck said simply. It's how they respond to defeat. The wisdom in the statement hung in the air for a moment before Major Blake nodded in understanding. And how would you say he responded? With honor, Chuck replied. When it mattered most. Colonel Roth checked his watch and stood. We should head back down. The final bout is about to begin. Major Blake thanked them both for their time, and they made their way back toward the floor level. As they descended the stairs, Colonel Roth glanced at Chuck. That was generous of you, he said. What you said about Cross. Chuck's response was characteristically succinct. It was true. As they reached the floor level, they found Dane Cross waiting near their seats. He straightened as they approached, his demeanor markedly different from earlier in the evening. Gone was the swagger, replaced by genuine respect. Mr. Norris, he said with a slight nod. Colonel. Sergeant Cross, Roth acknowledged. Chuck simply returned the nod, his expression neutral but not unkind. I wanted to thank you again, Cross said to Chuck. Not just for the lesson in the cage, but for what you said just now. He gestured toward the broadcast booth. I heard it on the monitor backstage. Chuck studied him for a moment, then extended his hand. Cross took it. The handshake, firm and respectful. The hardest fights, Chuck said quietly, are the ones we have with ourselves. Cross nodded, understanding the deeper meaning behind the simple statement. As they released the handshake, Boulder Reyes approached, indicating that they were needed for a group photo of all the night's participants. As Cross moved to join the other fighters, Colonel Roth turned to Chuck. Will you join the photo? Chuck shook his head slightly. This is their night. Roth nodded in understanding and moved to join the group, leaving Chuck standing alone at the edge of the floor area. As the photographers arranged the fighters, Cross glanced back at where Chuck stood. Their eyes met briefly across the distance, teacher and student, legend and learner. In that silent exchange, more was communicated than words could ever convey. The torch of martial wisdom wasn't passed through loud proclamations or public ceremonies, but in quiet moments of recognition between those who understood its true weight. As camera flashes illuminated the group of elite warriors, Chuck turned and made his way toward the exit. His part in the evening's story was complete. What followed would be up to those who had witnessed and experienced the lesson, particularly the young SEAL who had entered the cage as one person and left as another. Chuck moved through the backstage area with the same quiet dignity that characterized his every action. Security personnel and event staff nodded respectfully as he passed, no one attempting to delay or detain him. As he reached the private exit that would lead to the parking area, he paused, looking back toward the arena one last time. The sound of the crowd washed over, him excited, energized, but somehow more respectful than before. Something had shifted in the building tonight. A recalibration of what was valued and celebrated. It wouldn't last forever, such moments rarely did, but for now, at least, the balance between spectacle and substance had been restored. Satisfied, Chuck pushed through the exit door and stepped into the cool Las Vegas night, leaving behind an arena forever changed by his silent eloquence. Dawn broke over Las Vegas. the city's neon gradually yielding to the soft gold of desert sunlight. Inside a sparse hotel gym, Dane Cross moved through a series of katastha formal exercises he had largely abandoned years ago in favor of more combat-oriented training. His movements were deliberate, focused, stripped of the flashy embellishments that had characterized his public persona. Each stance, each transition, each strike was executed with newfound attention to fundamentals. Not performed for an audience or cameras, but for the pursuit of something deeper, reconnection with the roots of his martial training that had been overshadowed by accolades and attention. Cross completed the sequence and paused, breathing steadily. He reached for his phone, checking the time 5:47. But his attention was caught by the flood of notifications. Social media was ablaze with clips from the previous night, his name trending alongside Chuck Norris's. He scrolled briefly through the headlines. Chuck Norris schools. Cocky Navy SEAL in surprise. Showdown. Legend vs. Loudmouth. Humility wins by knockout. Viral. The moment Chuck Norris silenced the trash talk. A week ago, this kind of attention, even negative, would have thrilled him. The algorithm didn't distinguish between praise and criticism, it only measured engagement. Any publicity was good publicity in the economy of likes and shares. But now, it felt hollow. Almost irrelevant. Cross set the phone down without opening any of the links and returned to his training. As he moved through another sequence, his mind replayed not the physical confrontation in the cage, but the moment afterward in the tunnel. Chuck's words. The loudest person in the room is rarely the strongest, had lodged in his consciousness, becoming a touchstone against which he now measured his thoughts and actions. The hotel room door opened quietly as his teammate, Lieutenant Ryan Shaw, entered with 2 coffee cups. "Thought I'd find you here," Shaw said, setting 1 cup down on a nearby bench. "Been at it long?" "Couple hours," Cross replied, completing his form before reaching for the coffee. "Thanks." Shaw leaned against the wall, studying his friend with curious eyes. "You good? After everything last night?" Cross took a long sip before answering. "Better than good, actually." "Really?" Shaw sounded skeptical. "Because most guys wouldn't be after what happened." Cross smiled slightly. "Most guys didn't get the gift I got." "Gift?" Shaw raised an eyebrow. "That's an interesting way to frame having your ass handed to you in front of millions." "That's because you're looking at the wrong part," Cross replied, setting his coffee down and resuming his stance. "Watch this form and tell me what you see." He began moving through the kata again, each position crisp, each transition fluid, each strike precise. Shaw watched with growing appreciation. "Damn," he said when Cross finished. "That's different. You've stripped away all the flash." Cross nodded. "All the noise, too. Just the essence now." Shaw shook his head slightly, bemused. "One session with Norris did that?" "Not the session," Cross corrected. "The realization that came with it." He paused, searching for the right words. "I've been fighting to be seen, to be acknowledged. Every match, every video, every post-it was all about visibility. And now?" Cross gestured to the empty gym. "Now I'm training when no one's watching. For myself, not for the audience." He smiled. "Turns out there's freedom in that." Across town, in the executive offices of the MGM Grand, Colonel Adrian Hawk Roth sat reviewing the preliminary numbers from the charity event. Beside him, Major Samira Blake scrolled through her own tablet, compiling data for the official press release. "Final tally on donations," she announced, looking up. $4.7 million more than double last year's event. Roth nodded, satisfaction evident in his expression. "The extra publicity didn't hurt." "You think that was coincidence?" Major Blake asked, a knowing smile playing at the corners of her mouth. "Chuck just happening to be there on the night Cross was scheduled to fight?" Roth's poker face was impeccable. Chuck supports veterans' causes. Has for decades. Uh-huh. Major Blake wasn't convinced, and it's pure chance that he was seated front row, directly in Cross's line of sight? Roth allowed himself a small smile. I may have mentioned to Chuck that we had a young fighter who could benefit from his particular brand of wisdom. You set the whole thing up, Major Blake concluded. I created an opportunity. Roth corrected. What happened with it was entirely up to them. He gestured to the donation figures on her tablet. Besides, look at the result. The real winners are the veterans who'll benefit from these funds. Major Blake couldn't argue with that. And Cross? You think the lesson took? Roth's expression grew more thoughtful. Time will tell, but if I were a betting man. He trailed off, then changed the subject. How's the media coverage shaping up? Beyond anything we could have hoped for, she replied, pulling up a series of analytics. The clips have gone viral across every platform, but there's something interesting about the comments. Oh? People aren't just talking about the physical confrontation. They're discussing the philosophy behind it. The contrast between showmanship and substance. Between ego and discipline. She scrolled through some examples. It sparked a genuine conversation about what martial arts is supposed to represent. Roth nodded, pleased but not surprised. That's Chuck for you. He doesn't just teach the individual, he teaches everyone watching. Major Blake's phone buzzed with a text message. She glanced at it, then looked up at Roth with raised eyebrows. Speaking of teaching, she said, looks like Cross just requested permission to address the next class of special warfare candidates at Coronado. Says he wants to talk about discipline over dominance. Roth's smile deepened. Like I said, if I were a betting man. In another part of Las Vegas, Mike Boulder Reyes sat in a quiet breakfast spot, nursing a coffee and reading the sports section of the local paper. His own defeat at Cross's hands had been overshadowed by the subsequent events, reduced to a mere footnote in most coverage. Far from being bothered by this, Reyes found it almost amusing. The waitress stopped by his table, refilling his cup. You're that fighter from last night, aren't you? The Marine? Reyes nodded politely. That's me. Tough break, she said sympathetically. That SEAL guy was something else. He was, Reyes agreed. But so was what happened after. The waitress nodded emphatically. Chuck Norris! Can you believe it? My dad had a poster of him on our garage wall my whole childhood. She leaned in slightly. What was he like? Up close. Reyes considered the question carefully. Exactly what you'd hope, he said finally. The real deal. After the waitress moved on, Reyes's phone buzzed with a text message. Still up for that training session? Cross. Reyes smiled slightly, typing back. Name the time and place. The response came quickly. How about Chuck's dojo? He's expecting us next week. Reyes nearly spilled his coffee. He stared at the message for a long moment before responding with a simple, I'll be there. Setting the phone down, he returned to his newspaper with a renewed sense of purpose. What had started as a humbling defeat had somehow transformed into an unexpected opportunity. In fighting, as in life, endings often doubled as beginnings. Outside the cafe window, a group of young Marines in physical training gear jogged past. Calling cadence. Reyes watched them, suddenly struck by the connection between what he had witnessed in the cage and what these men were learning through their service discipline. Respect. Humility. The same values that had seemed briefly endangered in the world of exhibition fighting had been powerfully reasserted by an 80-year-old man who hadn't needed to throw a single full-power punch to make his point. Reyes smiled at the synchronicity, then signaled for his check. He had preparations to make. Meanwhile, in a private hangar at McCarran International Airport, Chuck Norris boarded a small jet that would take him back to his ranch in Texas. He moved with the same quiet efficiency that characterized all his actions. carrying only a small duffel bag and nodding politely to the flight crew. As he settled into his seat, he removed his phone from his pocket and checked a single message that had arrived earlier that morning. "They're both coming. Tuesday at 9. Roth." Chuck allowed himself a small smile as he tucked the phone away. No response was necessary. The wheels were in motion, the next chapter already beginning to unfold. Captain Lisa Vaughn, the co-pilot, approached respectfully. "Mr. Norris, we're honored to have you aboard. Everything comfortable for you?" Chuck nodded. "Perfect, thank you." She hesitated, then added, "My father was stationed at Osan Air Base in Korea when you were filming there in the 70s. He still talks about meeting you. Said it changed how he approached his service." "Your father's name?" Chuck asked. "Technical Sergeant James Vaughn." Chuck thought for a moment, then nodded. "I remember him. Good man. Please give him my regards." Captain Vaughn's eyes widened slightly. "You remember him? After all these years?" Chuck's expression was warm, but matter of fact. People matter more than time. The simple philosophy, delivered without pretension, left the co-pilot momentarily speechless. She nodded respectfully and returned to the cockpit. A new story to share with her father now added to the family lore. As the jet taxied toward the runway, Chuck gazed out the window at the Las Vegas skyline. The city of spectacle and illusion seemed an appropriate backdrop for what had transpired, a reminder that beneath the flashing lights and manufactured personas, authentic character still mattered. The pilot's voice came over the intercom, announcing their imminent departure. Chuck leaned back in his seat, closing his eyes as the engines spooled up. His work here was done, but its effects would continue to ripple outward, not just through Cross and those who had witnessed the confrontation directly, but through the thousands who would see the clips, read the stories, and perhaps, just perhaps, reconsider their own understanding of strength, discipline, and respect. That was the nature of true legacy, not the monuments built to commemorate it, but the quiet influence that continued long after the teacher had left the room. 3 days later, at the Naval Special Warfare Command in Coronado, California, Dane Cross stood before a group of SEAL candidates. As one of the most decorated operators in recent years, he regularly participated in the training program, sharing insights from his field experience. But today's session was different. The young men before him, tired, salt-crusted, and hungry for any advantage that might help them survive the brutal selection process, noticed it immediately. Gone was the larger-than-life persona that had made Cross a minor celebrity in military circles. In its place was something more grounded, more authentic. "The most important weapon you'll ever wield," Cross began, his voice carrying across the training yard, "isn't your rifle, your knife, or even your fists. It's your discipline." The candidates listened intently, some still dripping seawater from their morning evolution. "In the field, under fire, you won't rise to the occasion," Cross continued. "You'll default to your training, to the habits you've built, to the person you've become when no one's watching." A young candidate in the front row raised his hand. "Sir, we saw the video. With you and Chuck Norris." Cross nodded, not surprised. "And what did you see?" "You got beat," the candidate said bluntly. "No," Cross corrected. "I got taught. There's a difference." He proceeded to break down the encounter not from a place of excuse or justification, but as a tactical and philosophical analysis. What had started as embarrassment had been transformed, through reflection, into a valuable teaching tool. "The loudest person in the room," Cross said, echoing Chuck's words in the tunnel, "is rarely the strongest. Remember that when you're downrange. Remember it when you're training. And remember it when you're deciding what kind of operator, what kind of person you want to be." After the session, as the candidates dispersed to their next evolution, the class leader hung back. He approached Cross with measured steps, clearly weighing his words carefully. "Permission to speak freely, sir?" Cross nodded. "Go ahead. That version of you, the one talking to us today, the one we need to learn from, not the one from the videos." The young man paused. "If that makes sense." Cross studied him for a moment, seeing a reflection of his younger self, hungry for validation, desperate to prove himself. But this candidate had something Cross had lacked at that age: the wisdom to recognize substance over spectacle. "It makes perfect sense," Cross replied. "And thank you." The young man nodded once, then jogged to catch up with his classmates, leaving Cross to reflect on how completely his perspective had shifted in the span of just a few days. That evening, Cross sat alone in his quarters, Chuck's business card on the desk before him. In 6 days, he would fly to Texas for the promised training session. What exactly that would entail, he wasn't sure. But for the first time in a long while, he was approaching something not as a chance to prove himself, but as an opportunity to learn. He picked up his phone and opened his social media accounts platforms where he had cultivated his brash, undefeated persona over years. After a moment's consideration, he began deleting posts the most boastful, the most disrespectful to opponents, the most focused on self-promotion. It was a small gesture, perhaps meaningless in the grand scheme, but it felt right, a digital reflection of the internal recalibration taking place. As he finished, a notification appeared, a direct message from a young fighter he had previously dismissed as unworthy of his attention. "Saw what happened with Chuck. Respect for how you handled it afterward. Still open to that training session you mentioned?" Cross smiled slightly and typed back, "Absolutely. But I'll be learning alongside you, not teaching." He set the phone down and moved to the window of his quarters, looking out over the training grounds where the next generation of special operators were being forged. In the distance, candidates were completing an obstacle course, their instructors pushing them to find resources within themselves they didn't know existed. It struck Cross that this was exactly what Chuck had done for him in that cage: pushed him past his comfortable assumptions, forced him to confront the gap between his perception of himself and reality. But unlike the instructors currently bellowing at the struggling candidates, Chuck had done it without raising his voice, without even speaking at all, until the lesson had been fully delivered. That was mastery of a different order. Not just technical skill or physical prowess, but a deeper understanding of human nature, of how transformation really happens. Across the country, on his Texas ranch, Chuck Norris moved through his morning routine. Despite his age, he maintained the discipline that had defined his life, rising before dawn, training with the same focus he had brought to the cage in Las Vegas, tending to his responsibilities with quiet purpose. His ranch hands had grown accustomed to seeing their employer practicing forms in the early morning light, the weathered martial artist moving with a grace that defied his years. They respectfully kept their distance, understanding that this was more than exercise. It was meditation, philosophy, a way of being that transcended mere physical maintenance. As the sun crested the horizon, painting the landscape in warm gold, Chuck paused in his training to look out over his property. In less than a week, 2 fighters would arrive, humbled by experience, one honored by invitation, both seeking something beyond technique or glory. His longtime groundskeeper, Ernesto, approached with a thermos of coffee. "Special visitors coming, I hear," he said, pouring a cup and offering it to Chuck. Chuck accepted with a nod of thanks. "Tuesday. The young SEAL from the video?" Ernesto asked. He had worked for Chuck for nearly 20 years and had earned the right to occasional direct questions. "Him and the Marine he fought before me." Ernesto considered this, then nodded approvingly. "Good. They both have something to learn." Chuck sipped his coffee, his expression thoughtful. "We all do." Ernesto smiled at the characteristic humility. After 2 decades, It still impressed him how someone who had achieved so much could remain so grounded. In a world obsessed with self-promotion and personal branding, Chuck Norris remained refreshingly authentic, as uninterested in claiming credit as he was in casting blame. "The dojo is ready," Ernesto said. "Anything else you need prepared?" Chuck shook his head. "Just the usual accommodations in the guest house." As Ernesto turned to leave, Chuck added, "And make sure the old uniforms are laid out." The groundskeeper nodded, understanding the significance. The traditional martial arts uniforms, not the flashy modern fighting gear, but the simple white dobok of traditional Tang Su Daowold, set the tone for what was to come. A return to fundamentals, to first principles. Chuck returned to his exercises, moving with the fluid precision that decades of training had ingrained. Not fighting against time or age, but working in harmony with theme, adapting, adjusting, advancing, in understanding, if not in physical capability. This was the legacy he had built over a lifetime. Just the championships, or the films, or the cultural phenomenon he had become, but the philosophy he embodied. The understanding that true mastery wasn't about dominating others, but about conquering oneself. That respect couldn't be demanded, only earned. That strength wasn't measured by how hard you could hit, but by how centered you could remain when the world tried to move you. In a small office at the rear of his property, Chuck's assistant, Maria, was handling the day's correspondence. Among the stack of letters was one that had been forwarded from his manager, a note from a 10-year-old boy in Ohio who had seen the viral video of the confrontation with Cross. "Dear Mr. Norris," the letter read in careful printing, "I saw how you fought that Navy SEAL who was being mean. You didn't yell or get mad. You just showed him how to fight right. My dad says that's what real black belts do. I start karate classes next week, and I'm going to try to be like you." Maria set the letter aside for Chuck to read later, knowing it would mean more to him than the numerous media requests and endorsement offers that had flooded in since the event. Throughout his career, this had been his true measure of success, not box office numbers or championship titles, but the moments when his example inspired others to find their better selves. In Las Vegas, the Warriors United event had already faded from the headlines, replaced by newer spectacles and controversies. But its effects continued to reverberate through the lives it had touched: the fighters who participated, the veterans who benefited, the audience who witnessed a moment of authentic wisdom amid the carefully choreographed entertainment. And in a small dojo on a Texas ranch, preparations were being made for a different kind of encounter, not a confrontation, but a continuation, not an ending, but a beginning. The torch was being passed, not with fanfare or ceremony, but in the most appropriate way possible, quietly, respectfully, from one practitioner to another, from those who had walked the path to those just beginning to understand its true direction, because that was how real change happened, not in spectacular moments captured for posterity, but in quiet decisions made when no one was watching. Not in victories trumpeted to the world, but in defeats absorbed and transformed into wisdom. This was the lesson Chuck Norris had delivered without words in that Las Vegas cage. This was the legacy being built, one silent example at a time, not in how loudly you could proclaim your strength, but in how quietly you could demonstrate it. Not in defeating others, but in mastering yourself. Not in demanding respect, but in living in a manner worthy of it. A legacy defined not by noise, but by its absence. Not by spectacle, but by substance. Not by what was said, but by what didn't need to be. Up next, we have 2 more incredible stories that are waiting for you. Just click the image you want to watch, and it will take you there. If you enjoyed this video, make sure to subscribe. It would mean a lot.